On the last episode of Ethocast, I dipped my toe into the waters of chapter culture. Let's keep that conversation going because the guest on this episode, oh man, he can tell you a thing or two. His name is Gregory Parks. Now, you might not know him by his day job, which is Associate Dean of Strategic Initiatives and Professor of Law at Wake Forest University. Now, the way you probably know him is one of his many research areas, fraternal organizations and the law, which includes a pretty deep exploration into the culture of fraternities and sororities at all levels. He's also served as an expert witness in hazing cases. Gregory has written several, and I do mean several books, one of which is Brothers and Sisters, Diversity in College Fraternities and Sororities. He is an active member of Alpha Phi Alpha, and also he holds a JD from Cornell University and a PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Kentucky. All right, let's get into this episode Delta of Ethocast with Gregory Parks. Welcome to Ethocast, a podcast about sound leadership practices to boost life in college fraternities and sororities. I'm Eddie Francis, presenter of Followership to Leadership and the Black Greek Success Program. Presentations designed to help Greeks become more effective leaders. On Ethocast, I'll share lessons learned from my college days, my career journey, and leadership research. Ethocast is a 4-hour edification limited series and presented by Edify Ventures. This is Ethocast, leadership to the letter. Joining me on Ethocast is Gregory Parks, and he's someone whose name you have probably heard. And Gregory is he's a frat brother. He is someone whose work I really, really respect. He's a professor of law, and he is also an author. As a matter of fact, this man writes books like crazy. You know what? He just wrote a book while I was doing this intro. And he's also an expert witness in hazing cases. Hey, man, thank you so much for joining me on the Ethocast. How are you?
I'm well, brother. Good to be with you.
Yeah, man, it's good to have you, man. So this is something my wife and I, she's a Zeta, she and I joke about this with you all the time. So we'll be having dinner. I kid you not, we do this. We'll be having dinner, and by the end of dinner, it was like, oh, man, Parks just wrote another book. Did you see? So...
Hey, got to crank it out.
You do crank them out. So the reason I wanted to talk to you, especially in this forum, is that I really, want college Greeks to understand what ethical leadership looks like, so that they can have their chapters run in a very substantive way, in a helpful way. And one of the things, I mentioned this on the previous episode, is I mentioned the importance of understanding the culture of a chapter. This is something you deal with a lot. As a matter of fact, this is kind of how you and I connected, because you saw something that I wrote, and we just had a really cool conversation about what the culture of a chapter looks like, what the culture of an organization looks like. But I think it's something that a lot of us kind of gloss over in Greek life. And so first things first, let's hear about you. Talk about what it is that you do when it comes to Greek life, but then also in the context of your work, talk about how understanding organizational culture fits into that.
Yeah, you threw me off when you said first things first, and my mind automatically went to the Notorious B.I.G. But being a hip hop head. So my name is Gregory Parks. I'm a professor of law at Wake Forest University School of Law. I've been researching and writing about fraternities and sororities generally for 20 plus years, and included in that D9 organizations. As a lawyer, I've grappled with the ways in which these organizations and their members violate the law, or what the law means for organizations like this. And as a social scientist, I've grappled with a broader range of issues these organizations face, and how individuals and groups interact within these organizations, and how these interactions affect these organizations' performance towards their ultimate goals or values. And in an effort to make sense of all of that, I've necessarily had to address the set of attitudes, beliefs, rules, systems, and values that influence leaders, members, and employees' behavior within such organizations. And so, I have a sort of a big picture approach to thinking about fraternities and sororities, and therefore a highly interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary perspective or strategy around how I try to think about them.
And I really, that's one of the things I like about what you do is the fact that it is inter or multidisciplinary. You mentioned social science. What are some of the other disciplines that you pull in your work?
So I'm trained as a clinical psychologist and criminal psychologist, but those disciplines really don't answer the big questions.
Mhm.
So in psychology, I'd say cognitive and social psychology, certainly organizational behavior psychology, sociology, um, uh, education, student development theory,
Mm.
um, economics and behavioral economics. You know, pretty much any social science, I think, can have something to say about these organizations. And I recognize that I'm not trained in all those disciplines. So, that's the reason why often what you get from me are edited volumes or collaborative, co authored pieces, because I'm trying to find people with expertise in different areas that can shed some light on issues and ways in which I can't, or I just don't feel like, you know, spending the next X number of years trying to develop my expertise in that area to give you a paper or a chapter or a book. So,
So, culture, how do you define it?
culture, I think it's embedded in what I just said. It's the set of attitudes, beliefs, rules, systems, values that influence the ways in which leaders, members, and employees conduct themselves within an organization.
Mhm.
Um, and I think it's important, and thank you for having this conversation. I think it's critical for organizations because um, quite often, whether it be with fraternities and sororities or in other organizational contexts, even here where I work at Wake Forest, whenever we talk about change and addressing some big issue, my rebuttal is always too often organizations are thinking about new rules, regulations, policies, procedures, and operations. But if the hearts and minds of the people aren't shifted, your rules, regulations, policies, and procedures won't matter.
Yeah.
And so it is really difficult to change how people see the world, how they experience it, how they feel about it. But that really is the rub if you want to address deep issues within any organization or institution.
The views expressed on Ethocast do not necessarily reflect the views of the hosts, guests, or any entities with which this podcast's participants are affiliated. Questions, comments, email eddie@eddiefrancis.com. Would you say that a big part of culture is that you have written rules, you have unwritten rules, and then you have unwritten rules, and then you have sub unwritten rules under that? I mean, it just seems like there's so much of the behaviors, there are so many of the customs that they seem to be moving targets a lot of times, especially from chapter to chapter. Would that be a fair way to characterize some of the culture, at least?
Maybe. I mean, I think there's a book, I think by Heath and Heath, titled Switch: How to Change Things When Change is Hard. And they have a basic thesis that when you want to change something, you've got to be mindful of three things: the rider, the elephant, and the path. The rider is the sort of rational side of people. The elephant is the irrational, the emotional, the subconscious. The path is how you get from point A to point B.
Mm.
I think what we are often talking about in organizations when it comes to challenges and opportunities is just the rider. What are the sort of rational pieces of the puzzle? Well, if you change this rule from A to B, then it means the people are going to change. It doesn't mean the people are going to change, because the irrational, emotional, subconscious side of people is much more influential in their decision making day to
Yeah.
day than the rational side. And then there may be all kinds of obstacles within an organization that just won't allow you to get from point A to B, even if you change the rules. And I
Mhm.
think there's sub rules and sub rules. I think the way to put it is what Donald Rumsfeld said years ago. Donald Rumsfeld was what was he, Secretary of
Is it
um,
defense?
the Secretary of Defense under
Yeah.
Bush. And he said there are known knowns, there are known unknowns, and there are unknown unknowns. And
I remember when he said that. Yeah.
the known knowns are the things we know
Hmm.
that we know. And that's what I think organizations usually are dealing with. And then there are known unknowns. There are things that we don't that we know that we don't know or understand, and the unknown unknowns are the things we're not even aware of that exist.
Yeah.
And those are the biggest and thorniest issues. If you're not aware of them, you don't know how to tackle them. As an old cartoon that you and I probably are aware of, that some of your listeners might not be, is GI Joe. Whenever they do their public service announcements on the cartoon, they'd say, "Now you know, and knowing is half the battle." But if you have no idea that an issue is out there or a set of dynamics are out there, then you have no hope in actually tackling it. And so I think if you stitch all these things together, that tells you what the culture of an organization is and why it's so difficult to address the culture when the culture is problematic for the sustainability and longevity of an organization.
Yeah, and what this makes me think about is something that I mentioned on my previous episode, is that a lot of times for us when we join these organizations or any kind of organization, even if it's a job that we select, if it's a church that we go to, if it's a professional organization that we join, or any kind of, family unit that we decide that we are more attached to, the aunts and the uncles or whoever, it seems to me that a lot of times what's going on is that we're all searching for some sort of meaning in these associations. And so um, when you have someone who says, okay, well, yeah, I know what the rules of my frat are, but here are the rules of my chapter, and I like these rules. It seems like what's going on subconsciously, and this is neither a good nor a bad thing. It seems like what's going on is that member is looking for some sort of meaning in what they're doing, even if it's something that is illegal, even if it is something that's unethical. There's still a sense of meaning. Is that something that you think kind of plays into this?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we all have social identities, meaning our identity is rooted in social groups that we're a part of. And the truth of the matter is, in any organization, your identity, yeah, is in part tethered to that national and international component or the highest level component.
Hmm.
But your day to day interactions are not with a national, international component, it's with the more
Mm.
local component. And
Hmm.
so, there's this whole research in organizational behavior on organizational commitment, and an employee at a major corporation, let's say Google, yeah, they may be committed to Google, but they're going to be more committed to the people who they see every day,
Yep.
who they work with,
Yep.
right? Because that's where the real relationships are made. And I think often if a person believes that doing A makes that organization better, even though the organization wants it to do B, one, they can only see what they can see at the local level. And two, sometimes maybe they're right. Maybe sometimes in an organization, the same as in society, pushing back against rules, archaic rules, is actually in the best interest of the organization, even if the organization doesn't see it that way.
Hmm.
And sometimes that necessitates, you know, honestly, breaking maybe what you might see as an unjust law,
Hmm.
right? If we had racial segregation and Martin Luther King says, we're going to protest for integration, we're going to have Rosa Parks sit at the front of the bus, we're going to, engage in X, Y, and Z practices. Yeah, you might get locked up because it's against the law, but is the law or the rule the proper law or rule to have on the books? And sometimes it's not.
Yeah. You mentioned our associations with people and how we align ourselves with other people. And this is something I learned when I was a job recruiter. And a lot of times when I would talk to a hiring manager about bringing someone in, or the candidates that I'm talking to, I'm really listening to the hiring manager, because I'm sitting there going, well, if I go out and bust my tail to go out and find the best possible candidates I can find, one of the things I learned is, it's an adage that we see and hear all the time, is that when people quit jobs, they're not really quitting the jobs; they're quitting people. They're quitting bad leadership, or they're quitting people who they just don't fit the culture of the place, and they're just quitting the people who create that culture a lot of times. And so, And so that's a really interesting point. You're listening to Ethocast. I'm Eddie Francis, and we're talking to Gregory Parks. And Greg he's a professor of law, but then also he's an author, and he's an expert witness when it comes to hazing cases. So chapter level, as you and I know, it's the entry point for folks when they get into Greek life, regardless of the type of fraternity or sorority. When it comes to a chapter, how does the I was going to ask you about how the chapter culture is formed, but it's kind of a chick that seems like a chicken or egg thing to me. But when it does come to the chapter level, I'll ask you this way: what is it about the culture of a chapter versus the culture of a national organization that can be really different at times? What have you seen in your research and or your studies?
Well, I think it depends on whether the general organization of a fraternity or sorority sees its chapters as franchises,
Mm.
or as our frat brother Lawrence Ross, I think, has said before, a loose federation of of
Oh
entities.
wow,
Um,
that's deep.
I, I think he said that, and I don't want to misattribute anything to him. If a national organization sees the chapters as franchises, for the most part, every chapter looks alike. There might be some minor influences given the cultural dynamics on that campus, an HBCU versus a PWI,
Mhm.
a large state school versus, say, an Ivy League or a small liberal arts college. But by and large, they look the same. If it's a loose federation, then you go from chapter A to chapter B, and you might want your child to join at chapter A, but when you see chapter B, you might say, no, this is inconsistent with what I might have imagined the organization to be.
And it's something that we talk about in marketing. You can either be the office on campus that has the special sauce, and you put the special sauce on top of the patty or underneath the patty. We don't care where you put the special sauce, but you better have the special sauce on that burger. Or we look at your burger and it's a smooth bun and not a sesame seed bun. It's like, oh wait, that's a sin, because we all talk about having special sauce on a patty with the lettuce, the cheese, and the sesame seed bun. And so, yeah, what are we? Are we doing the special sauce thing? Or are we doing a whole nother type of burger thing? Yeah, I hear you. I hear you.
Yeah, I think some of the issue also is I sense in many fraternities and sororities, and certainly in D9, we talk around issues,
Mm-hmm.
or we talk about an issue, but we don't get to the heart of it. As we say in Alpha, the seventh chapter of our history book, the leaven of self examination, organizations, I think, often resist soul searching
Mm.
because soul searching would necessitate and ultimately result in unearthing things that the members, and maybe the most powerful members, they don't want to have to
I
confront.
agree. We don't like to soul search individually for ourselves because we're going to find something that
No,
hurts.
no. I mean, as someone who, background in clinical psychology, I've done therapy, provided therapy for people. Most people, even with big issues, they don't go to therapy. When they do, they don't last. And even if they last, it's hard to peel back the layers of that onion. And it's the same thing with an organization. An organization is simply an aggregate mixture of its various members. And if members find it hard to do that individually, it's not surprising if the organization finds it difficult to do that as well.
Mm.
Which means when there are caustic elements to the organization that are part of its culture, either writ large or at chapter levels, you don't get the chance to truly uproot those things because the organization just isn't at a place in which it really wants to grapple with the root issues.
Mm. So, what are some of the things that can really what are some of the things that can really compromise the culture in either direction? I mean, if it's a great culture, what can really throw a culture of a chapter off, regardless of the type of organization, NPAC, Pan, Hell, IFC, whatever, it doesn't matter. But what are some of those things? And if you are talking about a culture that's not so great, what is something that disrupts that negative culture and maybe moves it in a more positive direction? What kinds of elements do you usually see?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are various pressure points. So let me tackle the first question and then the second. And these may mean different things in different
Yeah.
organizations, whether they be NPHC, NIC, NPC, NALFO, so on and so forth. One is just the old heads from the chapter.
Mhm.
Um, and they may have more influence in an organization where the vast majority of members are alumni members and college members.
Mhm.
What the broader campus dynamics, um, the ideas and attitudes of the most influential members or leaders in the organizations, traditions of the chapter, prevailing societal attitudes about something, the ceremonies and rituals that the chapter engages in. Could be organizational
Including some of
policies,
the unofficial ceremonies and rituals.
could be official or
Yeah.
unofficial.
Yeah.
You know, it depends on what your ceremonies and rituals, what kind of values they're trying to
Yeah.
articulate and how they're being reinforced. If they're not, robust ideals and rituals and ceremonies, and they're not being reinforced in various ways, you can't be surprised if they're not
Mhm.
inculcated in the members. Groupthink amongst members of the chapter, right? The idea that uh, groups engage in poor decision making, and even where there are dissenters, the dissenters either don't have a voice or they're scared to speak up. Whether you have strong top down leadership and what the top down leadership says, and the extent to which intimidation and threats, as I say, in sort of in the context of groupthink, push members who might be divergent thinkers um, either to fall in line or to fall by the wayside. And so then the question becomes, what does it take to disrupt a negative culture? It takes
Mhm.
disruptors, right? It takes people who think differently than what the prevailing norm is within the organization or chapter. But quite often, unless you're part of an organization, it takes a lot to be a
I was
disruptor.
going to ask you, is it too dramatic to say that it takes bravery?
Um, it takes that. It takes you got to be noble, true, and courageous to be a
Mhm.
disruptor. But people hate disruptors, even when they know that disruption is
Yeah.
necessary. Right? Think about Colin Kaepernick. Um, I think most people recognize, especially those on the left, that he had a righteous cause. But there are many who still were irritated with them. There's a body of research that shows that um, that folks may like activists to a certain extent, even when those activists are aligned with those people's values and the issue they want to take up. But an activist necessarily has to push you beyond your comfort
Yeah,
zone.
well, this goes back to the story of the what was it? An old lady who stabbed Martin Luther King. I mean, he
Oh,
knew he was doing the right thing, but she was getting pushed way outside of her comfort zone, and she just wanted him to just stop it. Clearly,
yeah, yeah. And so organizations that are storied and historic, like fraternities and sororities, many of them have been around generations, if not hundreds of years. Um, I think for many, even as they may say and desire to tackle certain critical issues that the organizations need to tackle to have longevity, sustainability, and impact, what it truly will take is something that I don't think most members or leaders can
mhm.
contemplate. And so when there are those who come along, let's just say in a chapter, and a chapter has serious alcohol and hazing problem, and you've got a member of the chapter who comes along and says, we can't be the young men that we say we need to be in this organization, and we've got to stop this. And I'm here to be the voice of conscience in the chapter. What's most likely to happen is that person is going to be
Yeah,
ostracized.
yeah,
Um, and I'd like to say, you're only going to see that amongst 19 to 22 or 23-year-olds, but it probably is even more exacerbated amongst for organizations that have alumni
hmm
chapters. because if you're 30, 40, and 50, you're probably even more set in your ways than you were when you were
Take
21.
it from a former chapter
Um,
president. Yeah.
but getting back to your question, if you want disruption, positive disruption, you need
Yeah.
disruptors. But somehow those who are really committed to change, they've got to support disruptors, even if they're not disruptors themselves. Maybe that's not, they don't see themselves in that
Hmm.
way. They've got to find ways to support disruptors in their organization, where the organization needs some kind of fundamental change in order to be sustainable and have a lasting and if not ideally a growing impact in the spaces and places in which the organization operates, and that in the lives of its members and hopefully in the lives of individuals in the
Hmm.
community.
Those of us who have been, I've been a campus advisor before, and that was some pretty hard work. And the chapter I was an advisor for was small. I mean, I'm talking fewer than 10 brothers, but um, we look at something that the chapter's doing. We're professionals and we can see stuff coming from a mile away, right? But yet I remember when I was an undergrad, and when I was an undergrad, I didn't see it coming from a mile away. But there were times that my gut told me something and I did not listen, right? And so when is it realistic to expect college students to recognize when it is time to be a disruptor, when it is time to create a better culture within a chapter? um, how how does that go for college students, especially when there's a new line coming in, a new membership class coming in, and they're going to change the culture somehow, some way? Um, is it reasonable to expect college students to push back when something not so great is happening, or to keep it going, to keep carrying the ball when something great is happening with the chapter?
No, because new members of fraternities and sororities, and especially when you're talking about college members, they're only going to be on that campus, but at the most, a few
Yeah.
years.
Yeah.
They don't know but what you teach
Mm-hmm.
them.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you've got a 2 weekend, 3 weekend process, I'm not knocking length, but if your process is basically, here's a history, here's a basic history of the organization, here's a basic structure of the
Mm-hmm.
organization, here, don't haze, um, and here's some basics on how to run your
Mm-hmm.
chapter.
No
Then
underage drinking.
those, yeah, those are the basic guideposts. But if they don't know what the main issues are that the organization faces and has faced for arguably a protracted period, or the new issues before the organization, or the issues on the horizon, and what it really will take to address that, I don't see how you could reasonably expect. I don't see how you could reasonably expect a new 30-year-old, 40-year-old, 50-year-old alumni member to be an effective um, organic problem solver in the organization, let alone someone who's 19, 20,
Mm.
21.
Yeah.
If you want better members, meaning at least in this respect, if you want members who once they join, they can be organic problem solvers, help solve problems where they are, you've got to teach them what those problems are, and you got to give them the tools necessary to address the problem. But again, I'll circle back to the level of self-examination. If you only tell them what the surface level problems are, you'll get at best surface level solutions. The only way you get deep, lasting, um, system wide change is if the organization is ready to be honest with itself and with its you know established members and new members about the breadth and depth of challenges the organization faces, and what it's truly going to take, not in the short term but over the long term, to address those challenges. And again, I think the reason you don't have that is in part, or the power brokers don't know what the root issues are, and sometimes they do. Sometimes they're the
Yeah.
root issue. Powerful people don't want to give up power, and I think sometimes when they realize we all have a role to play in the problem and the solution, sometimes powerful people just don't want to. They don't want to relinquish what they have, and so they create a culture in which big issues are really ignored. And that's bigger than the chapter
Yeah.
dynamic, but I think it's central, right? I mean, a chapter is. I often make a distinction between progressive and conservative thinking around
Oh, you
fraternities and
did a
sororities. And
video
there's a whole
about
body
this
of
that I
research.
really, really liked. Yeah, yeah. Go ahead, please.
There's a whole body of research on how liberals and conservatives differ from one another psychologically. And we know historically conservatives tend to they believe in states' rights, right? Like punt to the states, given the 10th Amendment. And liberals are like, there's some issues that are so beyond a state, that reverberate beyond a state, or bigger than what a state can handle, or the state's going to do the wrong thing, that the federal government needs to come in and intervene and provide resources necessary to address a systemic problem. And I think about fraternities and sororities the same way. I mean, there are those who say that, yeah, those chapters out there, they've got a problem and they need to figure it out. But sometimes those issues are so long standing and so systemic that they're beyond the realm of what 10 guys or young ladies or 100 guys or young ladies in a chapter can actually solve. It necessitates the international organization bringing to bear the resources, whether it be financial, human capital, intellectual capital, to truly solve broad systemic problems, because the culture doesn't simply reside in the chapter. The culture is really the culture of the
Yeah.
organization.
How do new members change the culture of a chapter?
I think new members today likely become more liberal in how they think about issues, especially social issues. And they also are likely to think about faith and family and fun and finances and communications in sharply different ways as the years go by, because younger generations simply think about those things in different ways than
Mhm.
older generations. These organizations are likely to undergo radical changes in how new members specifically, think about themselves, how they think about themselves situated in the world and within these organizations. But we don't talk about it again. So I don't imagine that. So I imagine at some point these groups will look up and see themselves nationally or internationally as far afield from what their founders intended them to be, right? And so you take the average 20-year-old or 19-year-old and bring them into an organization, or bring her into an organization. Um, they're different than a 19-year-old was
Yeah.
50 years ago. It's just their life experiences and technology and who they associate with and how they view the world, and they bring all that with them to an organization. And again, if you're a loose federation of chapters and not an international franchise, they can have substantial influence over how that local chapter operates
Mhm.
and looks in ways that are very different than what, again, I think most importantly, the founders of the organizations may have intended for chapters and members to look like or behave like.
So we know that if a chapter really wants to trend in a productive direction, they are meeting whatever the touch points are for making sure that the mission is satisfied of the fraternity or sorority. They are executing, the national projects or the philanthropies or whatever it is that they have, and of course they are getting their GPAs and doing all of that good stuff, the stuff that they really need to do to make sure that they do their part to keep their fraternities and sororities going. So we want to have that. Where does the chapter begin? If they are saying, okay, we got to right this ship, um, where do they begin to create that more productive culture? Or if they do have a productive culture, how do they make it better?
I think the first step is really understanding their ritual, their mission statement, and the early history and intentions of their founders, right? I mean, as time goes on, and you see this with faith and reconciling it with modernity, there are foundational principles, and how do you make sense of those foundational principles even as time marches on? The principles shouldn't change, though how they get applied may be different than how they're applied decades ago, just because you've got new challenges and opportunities. I think a chapter has to look to the resources they have on their campus, student affairs and Greek life, whether that be education, training, advising, to help. Because I think most universities at least want to, they may not actualize it, but I think they want to have
Yeah.
healthy and robust chapters on their campuses. I think that a chapter should look to, if they've got an alumni advisor or advisory team, how they, or that person or that group of people can help them. But also the general organization has to be willing to support advisors, right? You were an advisor, I was a chapter advisor. In Alpha, I'd say this: it's the hardest job in the fraternity.
It ain't
Um,
fun.
and you get, and I think many organizations you
Yeah.
get no
Yeah.
support. Right? You've taken on the hardest job, you get no support. I think old heads can play a critical role. They can play a negative role, but they can also play a positive role because they've got institutional memory, vis-a-vis the chapter. And also, if they're doing what they need to do, they have human, intellectual, and financial resources to pour into the chapter and its members. And then I think the members have to demand the best from the general or national or international
Mm.
organization. The organization lives off of the financial resources of the members. And I think there, at the very least, there's an implicit contract that if we're giving you our money, then we need something in return. And that is, we need the support necessary to thrive, not just limp along, but we need the resources necessary to thrive in some objectively measured way. Um, the hard thing is, that means that a 19, 20, 21 year old has to be a very strong
Yep.
advocate for themselves, sometimes within and against systems that on paper have their best interests at heart, but how they conduct themselves,
Yeah.
not necessarily. And so they need, quote unquote adults. Technically a 18-year-old to 22-year-old's an adult, but they need 30, 40, 50-year-old members who are invested in the best for and of college chapters to be willing to be advocates on their part. I think if you can pull all these pieces together, I think where you find very healthy and vibrant college chapters, they probably have a lot of these elements combined. Where you see chapters dying on the vine, they probably don't have any of
Yeah.
these components, and not certainly in the way that you would think um, should be brought to bear if a chapter is to be healthy and vibrant.
You know, I'm going to end with this. We've seen fraternities and sororities of all types really lean into leadership training, and we know that's something that has to happen. Um, what do you think it looks like when that leadership training is productive and just it looks like the fraternity, the sorority is hitting on some good cylinders, and you see the young men and women who are members of their chapters, and you're going, okay, it looks like they were picking some things up. What does that look like when they are able to really take whatever training that they got and they were able to put it into action? What does that look like to you?
Well, one, I think there's a difference between leadership training and officer training. Um, you can be a leader and not be an officer, and you can be an officer and not an effective leader. You're just a person with a position or a title. And so I think organizations, well, let me say this. I think when your organization is 99% college members, you think about investing in college members differently than if your organization is 10% college members. But if at the end of the day, all of these organizations were founded on college campuses for and by college students, it doesn't matter if 90% of your members or 1% of your members are alumni. Your purpose is to invest in the next generation of members.
Absolutely.
And so, yes, there are they need to know how to run a chapter, the basic and technical duties of specific officers. They need to know the ritual, the mission statement, and the governing documents, constitution and bylaws, because they need to know the principles upon which the organization is founded and perpetuated. But they also need to know how to influence. They also need to know how to move people along around a common cause on the most critical issues that the organization, whether it be at the international level or the local chapter level, must face. And so it necessitates a depth of understanding of the broad range of issues that organizations need to face. And then lastly, a good leader knows him or herself. And so when you're talking about college students, they need to know about student development theory. They need to understand how they're thinking or why they're thinking about race and moral judgment and sexual and gender identity issues and leadership and core critical issues that their chapter may be facing, how and why they're thinking about them the way they are, if they're going to chart the best path, and that is being able to lead themselves before they lead anybody else.
Gregory Parks, he is a professor of law, and also he is an author, and he's an expert witness when it comes to Greek life and hazing. And man, thank you so much for joining me on Ethocast. This was a great conversation. Appreciate you.
Good to be with you, brother. Appreciate you. Take care.
Ethocast is a 4-hour edification limited series. If you like what you heard, like and follow this podcast for more leadership insights for your fraternity or sorority chapter. To find out how you can bring followership to leadership or the Black Greek Success Program to your campus or a campus near you, email today, eddie@eddiefrancis.com. Until next time, spread brotherly and sisterly love wherever you go.